Steve Earle has just released a loving tribute album to his son, Justin Townes Earle. The name of the record is JT, and we're going to talk about it right now. Hey everybody, Chris King here with Love Live Music. If you've been here before, thanks for coming back. If it's your first time and you love live music and you love to talk about music and you're looking for a place to get some music news and to discuss music information, hopefully you're in the right place. And if you think you're in the right place, hit that subscribe button, give me a comment, give me a like, and let's talk about live music. Let's talk about music. Today, we're going to talk about the new Steve Earle album, JT, Justin Townes Earle's songs. It's something that he had announced he was going to do shortly after Justin Townes Earle died last summer. Steve Earle said he was going to make this album where he would cover a bunch of the Justin Townes Earle catalog, make it available in a record for purchase, and all proceeds going to Justin's daughter, Etta St. James Earle. So that's the backstory on this album. Justin Townes Earle, an excellent artist in his own right, a troubled artist, as so many are, and he created a career outside of what his father has done. Steve Earle, of course, being an outlaw country artist that came out of the 80s where outlaw country wasn't a thing. It's like we had the outlaw country artist in the 70s, Willie Nelson and Waylon Jennings and Chris Christopherson. And then in the 80s, it was all quote unquote new country. And that new country was Kenny Rogers, or that new country was Randy Travis, Alan Jackson, George Strait, the Judds. We all thought, this new country music, it sounds so slick and produced. Little did we know, we'd be looking back on that fondly compared to newer country music, which I don't know. So, all that being said, we have a new album from Steve Earle, where he has taken Justin Earle's recordings. Justin Townes Earle. Justin Townes Earle, named after Townes Van Zandt. Steve Earle, Justin Townes Earle's father, recorded an album called Townes in 2009 that was a tribute to the music of Townes Van Zandt. Now he's doing a tribute to his son's music, Justin Townes Earle. I had a chance to work with Justin Townes Earle several times over the last 12 years. He's appeared in my venues here in Little Rock, Arkansas, at Sticky's Chicken Shack, at the Rev Room. And I remember my first time working with Justin, what I really thought was, it was a bit of a surprise knowing he was Steve Earle's kid coming into play. And goodness, he was young. He was very young at the time. He might have been 20 years old when a friend of mine drove him down to Little Rock so that he could perform in my venue. And Justin, a very polite individual, had a very cool, hip style about him of the time. It was kind of an old school, almost Hank Williams Sr.-esque vibe to his appearance, with slick back hair and with a tie, not like a tied tie, more like a string tie, not a bolo tie, but one of those string ties. And I think he didn't wear a sport coat, but he had some slacks and his shirt tucked in. He was very sharp. And one thing that I always remember about Justin Townes Earle, whenever we worked together, he was always very put together, very stylish with his stage presence, and very polite, and just all in all, a very nice, good person. And I don't know him deeply personally, but certainly we worked together four, five, six times. And so I had interaction with him and don't have anything bad to say about my time with Justin Townes Earle, nor do I with Steve Earle. He's a great guy in his own right, doing his own thing. All that being said, I'm here to review Steve Earle doing a record of like 10, 11 songs. 10 songs of Justin Townes Earle, and then he throws one in at the end that's one of his own compositions. But going track by track-ish with this, here's basically where I come up with my thoughts. Steve isn't trying to reinvent the wheel here necessarily. He's not trying to drop a bunch of new arrangements on something, almost like, hey, it was good, it was great in the first place. I don't have to change much. I'm just going to put my own voice on it, a little bit of my own stamp with my band. This is definitely, for the most part, a Steve Earle and the Dukes composition that we're listening to here. So whereas some of Justin's tracks may have just been Justin with sparse accompaniment, Justin was a heck of a finger picker. He was a really, really tasteful finger picker on guitar, and whereas Steve has more of an open sound, and we'll get to that on a later track, which is really brings my thought together there. But these are all pretty straightforward takes on the Justin Townes Earle tracks. One way to look at it is that the originals that Justin did have a youthfulness to them, in such a way of somebody that's maybe just learning and just exploring about the world in the songs. A lot of the songs are character driven, and whereas in Steve's readings of the same songs, it's an older, more weathered voice, maybe a voice that is singing it, looking in the rearview mirror, having lived it, is how it comes across. And that's totally fine. It gives an interesting juxtaposition between the two takes on the songs, Does that make sense, right? So we kick it off with what? I Don't Know. And I think this was on Justin's first full length. And several of the tracks come from the first record, the record that came out in 2008. I know there's another one that Bloodshot put out, but I'm not sure if it was a full length. But I Don't Know is the first track on this. And Justin's finger picking is really like old soul sounding. And that's just so evident, even on his earliest stuff, that that's really what he wanted to do. And I know he comes out of that time in, say, that first 10 years of the 2000s, where we saw bands like Old Crow Medicine Show come out. I know that Justin seems like he was in that same, perhaps, social circle where some guys were really pushing some of that old classic bluegrass, old classic country and western music style, that it sounds like a lot of that. And, Justin's is really just him on this I Don't Know track. It's him with his guitar, whereas Steve Earle, it sounds more like a hoedown, like, some good bluegrassy type stuff, and we see that on a few tracks. Next, Ain't Glad I'm Leaving. Definitely in Justin's original, it sounds like a Hank Sr. song, right? Sounds like Hank Williams Sr. And if you ain't glad I'm leaving, well, you better be. I think more or less is what the lyrics are. Maria is something that is more of an up-tempo thing that Justin had. As a matter of fact, I feel like Justin's version really at the time, and I think this was on a record that came out in 2009, maybe. Justin's version to me sounds like it could have been on Wilco's Yankee Hotel Foxtrot, whereas Steve's version sounds like it's an outtake from The Replacements or Elvis Costello. And I think if you use those as reference points, you could really tie together roots rock, right? I mean, we're talking about Justin Townes Earle coming out of a Hank Sr. phase, sounding of that nature, but now making a song that sounds like it's Wilco-esque, Steve Earle from an outlaw country background, Justin Townes Earle, Hank Sr., Steve Earle, Hank Jr., and how that music intertwines with some punk-ish rootsy punk stuff from Elvis Costello and the Replacements into something like Wilco that evolved out of a Americana revival in the mid-90s. All that kind of works together. And you hear a lot of that together in the song Maria. Far Away in Another Town. I really like the Justin Townes Earle version better. Something about Steve's version with the mandolin reminds me of, is there a mandolin in Moonlight Mile by the Stones? Something about it reminds me of that song. Maybe it's not the mandolin. Maybe it's just the chord changes. Next, we've got The Night They Killed John Henry, which is a real traditional Southern sound, which, man, Justin Townes Earle has just nailed this sound, really. It's like, probably when he came out, people were like, what is this? And, his version sounds like a sad story from the 1800s. It's like music that sounds like that. I'm telling a story about the 1800s and about the Civil War. And probably people are like, what in the world are you singing about, Justin Townes Earle? The Steve Earle version really sounds like a traditional bluegrass celebration. They killed John Henry, but they won't kill me. Turn Out My Lights. Really, you can hear the sadness. You can hear the crack in Justin Townes Earle's voice, the way he connects to the listener in this song. And I would love to know who sings backups. I think it was a girl that played cello in his band on several albums. You can correct me if I'm wrong. You can leave it in the comments if you know who it is. Lone Pine Hill is the next track. Steve Earle's version sounds like the prequel to Copperhead Road. I mean, this is, hey, they mowed down all the trees and I was going to the war to fight in Richmond in the 1800s. So it's fascinating that Justin Townes Earle's subject matter is writing about the 1800s and Steve's voice really works on this track. I liked it. Next, as we get towards the end of the album, we have probably the song that a lot of people feel like was Justin Townes Earle's really great last track that he developed, which is Champagne Corolla. It was on his album from 2017. And, it's got, the original's got some real funk to it. And it's one that probably never needed to be remade, but Steve puts his own stamp on it. All I'm asking you is, brother, do you know her? Pretty little thing riding around in a Champagne Corolla. I Googled Champagne Corolla Chevy to see when they were making that particular color, and I had no idea they're still making Corollas. Would you believe it? They're even making hybrid Corollas here in 2020. Did not know that. Saint of Lost Causes is the next track, and really probably my least favorite on the album. Also maybe the longest track on the album. Steve's reading is done in a drawl of his. It makes it sound like a Tom Waits song, and not that I don't appreciate Tom Waits. It just, that's what it sounds like. It's not my favorite. There's got to be a least favorite song on even your most favorite album. I can tell you my least favorite songs on Prince's 1999, and I can tell you my least favorite songs on Radiohead's OK Computer or Guided by Voices B1000. That doesn't mean that I don't like the song. It's just my least favorite. Saint of Lost Causes is my least favorite on this. Doesn't mean that I don't like what Steve Earle has done with this particular track. I just, not all of them can be your favorite. And Justin Townes Earle's version is really like succinct in his vocal delivery. Like his words are very clipped at the end, whereas I feel like Steve's got a drawl that he uses that gives it his own delivery, but I just prefer the original. Next, Harlem River Blues. This is back-to-back tracks that have been title tracks of Justin Townes Earle albums. And, this is good. Steve kicks it off with some acoustic strumming. You can really hear that open E string, in a way that Justin Townes Earle's stuff all seemed very tight, and his finger picking very deliberate and methodical. Steve's got a lot of loose, ragged roughness to him. And really, that's the difference between the two artists, right? They're both very good at what they do. And I don't know. These lyrics in Harlem River Blues. Tell my mother I love her. Tell my father I tried. Give my money to my baby to spend. It's sad because he's going to go drown himself in the Harlem River. And the subject matter is sad because we're dealing in general with some sadness here. The whole reason this album came out is sad. And that brings us to the last track, which Steve Earle himself wrote just for this album. And it's called Last Words. And, one thing that my parents have always told me is there's nothing sadder than a parent that has to bury a child. And I think that's pretty strong in its statement, and maybe something that's not necessarily debatable, really. A parent burying their child is a sad, sad thing. And Steve Earle has written the song Last Words about this moment because this is his child that died, unfortunately. And Steve putting this together and recording this album in a cathartic way to help him deal with the situation. And so we get to this track, Last Words, and knowing the reasoning behind this, it's hard to listen. This is a hard song to listen to and to keep it dry, This is a tough one. When he sings as the recurring chorus, last thing I said was I love you, and your last words to me were I love you too. And he says it once in the song, and the song lifts up and gets a little more energy. And then when it comes around the second time, the song gets a little more energy. And when it comes around the third time, there's the sadness of the end of the song. And that's how the album ends. Steve Earle's JT. It's a really great record. If you're a Justin Townes Earle fan, you should be buying this. If you're a Steve Earle fan, you should be buying this. And I say you should be buying this and not streaming this. And I'll have the link up for the Bandcamp down in the description. But you should be buying this because all the proceeds for the album sales go to Etta St. James Earle, Steve Earle's granddaughter, Justin Townes Earle's daughter, who has been left behind. And that's somebody that could use your support. My name's Chris King, and if you like this video, I like to make videos, and if you like it or if you subscribe to it, then I'm probably going to make more videos like the ones that are coming up on your screen right now. You know what I love? Live music.